Rich people don't pay taxes. You've heard it everywhere at dinner tables, in political debates, all over social media. It's a complaint that echoes across the world, a belief so common that almost nobody questions it. Emotionally, it just feels true. When you see billionaires building empires and corporations making record profits while wages barely budge, it's natural to assume the system is rigged. The rich must be escaping taxes, leaving everyone else to carry the burden. But what if the truth is far more complicated? What if history shows the exact opposite of what most people believe? What if, instead of never paying taxes, the wealthy have often paid so much that it reshaped entire nations, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force, and sometimes without even realizing they were funding empires, wars, and governments? And the biggest twist, the idea that rich people don't pay taxes, is a myth. It's a powerful story built on political narratives and half-truths that ignore how taxation has actually worked for the last 2,000 years. Today, we're going to rewind that story. We'll travel back to ancient civilizations, medieval kingdoms, the rise of European empires, the birth of the United States, the Gilded Age, the World Wars, and right up to our modern billionaire class. And in doing so, we'll uncover something almost nobody expects. The wealthy have consistently footed the bill for history. Welcome back to the Economic Rewind, Vault, the place where myths about money, power, and history are taken apart, piece by piece. And before we open this vault, if understanding the real mechanics behind financial myths helps you navigate your own future, consider subscribing. Not for me, but so you never miss the truths that people wish they knew earlier. Now, let's begin. Across social media and political arguments, the phrase "rich people don't pay taxes" has become a slogan, a weapon, and a kind of emotional truth. But slogans aren't history. Real history is far stranger, more revealing, and sometimes uncomfortable. Because the reality is this: throughout most of human civilization, the poor paid very little tax, the middle class paid almost nothing, and the rich paid nearly everything. Let's rewind to ancient Rome. Contrary to popular belief, ordinary Roman citizens paid almost no direct taxes. Their bread, grain, water, public games, and festivals were often funded by wealthy elites known as These weren't just voluntary acts of generosity. They were expected contributions. If a wealthy family refused, they risked political exile, public humiliation, or losing all their influence. The rich were expected to pay for roads, buildings, statues, military units, and even temples. Taxes weren't percentages. They were obligations. In other words, Rome's rich didn't avoid taxes. They were the tax system. Now, let's jump to medieval Europe. Kings rarely taxed peasants directly because peasants had nothing to give. Instead, they taxed the landowners, the lords, dukes, barons, and wealthy merchants who controlled all the economic activity. In many kingdoms, over 80% of all tax revenue came from the top 5% of wealth holders. Entire wars were funded through forced payments from the rich. Wealthy traders and nobles were required to finance armies under penalty of imprisonment or even execution. Rich people didn't escape taxes, they were the target. Let's move forward to England in the 1600s and 1700s. The rich paid property taxes, land taxes, import duties, and business licenses. The poor, once again, paid almost nothing. They were seen as the beneficiaries, not the contributors. When England needed money for wars, it created special taxes that specifically targeted wealthy landowners. When the British Empire expanded, merchants were expected to fund the expeditions. History doesn't show a world where the rich dodged taxes. It shows a world where governments deliberately aimed almost all their taxes upward. Now, fast forward to the United States. In the early days of America, income tax didn't exist, but tariffs, estate taxes, and excise taxes all fell almost entirely on the wealthy. And when the modern income tax was finally created in 1913, the top rate was just 7%. Within 5 years, during World War I, that rate skyrocketed to 77%, paid only by the richest Americans. During World War II, the top marginal tax rate hit an unbelievable 94%. 94%. Let that sink in. For decades after the war, the top tax rate remained above 70%. So did rich people escape taxes? The opposite is true. They funded the modern world as we know it. The highways, the schools, the military, the entire post-war boom, all of it was built on the backs of high-income taxpayers. But the story gets even more interesting, because while rich individuals paid enormous taxes, corporations were taxed even more aggressively. In the 1950s, the U.S. corporate tax rate reached 52%. Corporate taxes made up a huge portion of federal revenue. Companies were essentially financial partners of the state. So how did we get to a modern world where everyone believes the rich pay nothing? Two main reasons. First, loopholes and creative financial engineering exploded in the 1980s and 90s. This wasn't just because of greed. Governments themselves created tax codes filled with incentives, research credits, real estate depreciation, and offshore tax structures became legal and were even encouraged to spur economic activity. Second, the sheer size of wealth grew to levels nobody in history had ever seen. Even if billionaires today pay millions in taxes, those numbers look small compared to their total net worth. When someone worth $100 billion pays $200 million in taxes, people focus on the $100 billion, not the $200 million. Perception overshadows reality. And here's the historical twist. Even today, despite all the loopholes and criticisms, the data shows a familiar pattern. The top 1% of Americans pay over 40% of all federal income taxes. The top 10% pay over 70%, and the bottom 50% pay almost nothing. The system that existed in Rome, medieval Europe, and early America still exists today. A tiny group funds the majority of tax revenue. The myth persists because people confuse the percentage of income paid with the percentage of total taxes collected. They confuse headlines with data, and they confuse not paying as much as people think they should with not paying anything at all. But the historical record is clear. The wealthy have almost always been the biggest taxpayers, not because they wanted to be, but because societies were designed that way. Yet, this story isn't complete without addressing the part most people don't want to confront. Yes, there are rich people who avoid taxes. There are corporations that engineer entire networks of shell companies. There are billionaires who pay almost nothing in some years because of legal loopholes. But even that isn't new. Throughout history, the rich have always sought ways to protect their wealth through land, influence, or legal privilege. The difference today is visibility. Social media exposes what used to be hidden, and that information turns imbalance into outrage. So where does the truth really sit? The truth is this: rich people don't avoid taxes entirely. They avoid taxes strategically. They pay less than the public expects, but far more than the public realizes. They contribute more to government revenue than any other group in society. But they also protect their wealth more aggressively than any other group. This isn't a contradiction. It's the duality of wealth. And that duality has shaped nations. It built empires, funded wars, created infrastructure, destabilized governments, and triggered revolutions. The relationship between wealth and taxation is one of the oldest struggles in human history, and it has never been simple. If this changed the way you see the myth that rich people don't pay taxes, consider subscribing to the Economic Rewind Vault. Not for the numbers, but because knowing the truth makes you harder to manipulate. And in our next episode, we'll break down another belief that shapes our world. Countries go broke when debt gets too high. Is it true? Or is it another myth that collapses the moment we rewind history? You won't want to miss that one. See you in the next Rewind.